Hello? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Koen Brummer. I'm the Executive Director of the Hans van Mierlo Foundation, the Research Institute of D66. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Marchand Lecture, and I apologize for the few minutes it cost you to get in here. With more than 500 visitors, this is the largest edition in the history of these Marchand Lectures. And whether you are here with us in Tivoli Vredenburg or watching this lecture on YouTube from your home, I'm sure everyone is as thrilled as I am about our program for tonight. And that is why I would like to extend a special welcome to our speakers. Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who is with us live from abroad, Marietje Schaake and Dirk Bezemer, who are here in the venue with us. If we look around the world today, we are faced with daunting problems. Climate change, economic inequality, the financialization of finance, tech companies and governments in an age of digital surveillance. And, of course, the ongoing effects of the pandemic on the lives of so many citizens. These challenges are different in nature, but they do have one thing in common. We cannot start to address them if we do not answer one fundamental question first. How should we organize our societies if we want to combat any of these larger-than-life challenges in the first place? And for many years, the common opinion on dealing with public problems was clear. Government was part of the problem, not part of the solution. The state was merely a bureaucratic entity, unfit to fix anything at all. Markets, with their efficient private businesses and creative entrepreneurs, were the cradles of progress. They were the true problem solvers, right? It is a worldview perhaps best illustrated by one famous television interview by Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman, perhaps you've seen it, who told the audience that a simple pencil could only be fabricated because its parts were brought together by the market mechanism and not by some administrative program designed and run by civil servants. This revolution in the philosophy of government is often called the neoliberal turn, although we can call into question if true liberal political philosophy has anything to do with this. After all, for most of its history, liberalism was a radical political agenda, which strived for as much freedom, social justice, and agency for as many people as possible. This always went hand in hand with the realization these could not be achieved without a capable and functioning government. But nevertheless, it is clear that over the past decades, governments in Europe, the UK, and the US have been sidelined. A growing number of their tasks were privatized or simply cut, leading to a loss in their abilities to manage affairs. They became more and more dependent on consultancy firms, financial markets. They lost their institutional memory, and in the end, they lost the capabilities needed to deal with emerging crises on their own. And one of the fiercest critics of this process is Professor Mariana Mazzucato, a professor in the economics of innovation and public value at University College London. Mazzucato has been named one of the world's most influential economists. Her books reached millions of people, and her views on capitalism, innovation, growth, and the role of the state shaped policy programs from Brussels to Pretoria and from the World Health Organization to the World Economic Forum. In her analysis, government today is merely focused on fixing things when they go wrong, instead of improving people's lives by setting clear goals. One of her thought-provoking ideas is that we need to rethink what government is for altogether, the topic of her most recent book, Mission Economy, a Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. Taking the Apollo program of the 1960s as an example, Professor Mazzucato is leading the way in designing a new philosophy of government, one that is fit to deal with many of the challenges of the 2020s, varying from COVID responses and climate change to economic innovation. a new philosophy. Because different than the large top-down missions that put Armstrong and Aldrin on the moon, today's mission economy should be bottom-up and democratic, with room for citizens to participate and voice their opinions. I'm honored Professor Mazzucato accepted our invitation to discuss her ideas, even while she cannot be with us today in person, but we worked hard to make this work for everyone. I'm also very pleased with the two responding speakers, Director of the Cyber Policy Center of Stanford University and former member of European Parliament for D66, Marietje Schaake, and Dirk Bezemer, Professor of Economics at Groningen University. Both are preeminent scholars, and I'm happy they are willing to share the stage with us tonight. Dear audience, I would now like to give the floor to our host for the evening, Afke Groen, researcher at the Van Mierlo Foundation. Afke will introduce our speakers further and moderate the discussion afterwards. Afke, the floor is yours. Thank you all.
Wow. I haven't seen so many people together in ages. A very warm welcome to everyone. It is really great to see you. And a very warm welcome also to those who are following this event via the live stream. Although we cannot see you, we know that you're also here. A very special welcome, of course, to our outstanding speakers this evening. Professor Mariana Mazzucato joining us from the other side of the canal via video call. And Marietje Schaake and Dirk Bezemer joining us here in Tivoli Vredenburg in Utrecht. Now, I fully realize that as your moderator tonight, I am between you and our wonderful speakers, but I do have 3 practical announcements to make. The first concerns the program. In a moment, I will give the floor to Professor Mazzucato. She will deliver her Marchant Lecture 2021 in the next 30 minutes or so. We will then have a Q&A with her for about 20 minutes. This Q&A will also be joined by Marietje Schaake and Dirk Bezemer on the stage right here. Next, Marietje Schaake and Dirk Bezemer will deliver their replies to the Marchant Lecture and will each take about 15 minutes. And afterwards, we have time for another Q&A with the both of them. The second announcement I need to make is about how you can ask questions in the audience. So if you are joining us from the live stream, you can post your questions in the comments section. My colleagues will then make sure that the questions find their way to me. If you are here with us in Tivoli Vredenburg, you can ask your questions at one of the 3 microphones that are in this theater. One is right over here in front of me, one is on the side over there, and there's another one on the side over there. So just have a look around you to see where the nearest microphone to you is. Importantly, given COVID restrictions, we only allow 1 person at the microphone at a time because we need to clean the microphone after someone has spoken. So if someone else is at the microphone that is closest to you already, remain seated and be a little patient. The third and briefest announcement that I need to make concerns your telephones. Please do make sure they are on silent mode. Now, it is an absolute honor to introduce to you Professor Mariana Mazzucato. She is one of the leading thinkers on the future of the economy and society at large. So she's Professor of Innovation and Public Value Economics at University College London, and she is also the founder and director of the university's Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose. For her outstanding work on the future of capitalism, innovation, and the entrepreneurial state, she has received numerous international awards. Her lecture today will be on the topic of her latest book, which is called Mission Economy, a Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. Professor Mazzucato, in short, tells us to think bigger. With ambitious private-public partnership, the method that brought us to the moon more than 50 years ago now, capitalism needs to be reformed. Professor Mazzucato, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. We had some technical difficulties before, but thank you so much to the foundation. Thank you to Cohen, to AFCI for your words, and it's a huge disappointment that I cannot be there due to all the complications with travel and quarantining and so on. So what I would really like to talk about this evening is why it's not good enough to complain. We all complain, and we have lots of reasons to complain. But in order to actually have a different type of capitalism, we need to really debunk a lot of the underlying assumptions and the theorizing of what's gotten us to the very difficult situation we're in. And we should remember that John Maynard Keynes, a very powerful and important high-impact economist who was writing after the Great Depression, had this very important phrase that practitioners who think they're just kind of doing stuff on the ground, whether in the policy community or the business community, unfortunately, are often guided by defunct, problematic economic theorizing. So in order to have new practice, new policy, we really also need to rethink how we understand the world, how we understand the economy, how we understand capitalism, how we understand all the different actors in this system, and fundamentally rethink their governance structures, but also their interrelationships. And I should say, just kind of putting out there some fundamental pillars that for me, the economy itself and this concept of the market economy, is already often quite faulty. Markets are not kind of just out there and they sometimes go wrong and government has to intervene. The market system itself is an outcome of how we govern all the different institutions and organizations within the system, and especially how they interrelate one to another. So a lot of my work in my previous books in the Entrepreneurial State, The Value of Everything, and the more recent book, Mission Economy, have really been about rethinking the governance of the state, not because I think the state is the most important actor. And of course, every time I use the word state, don't think of kind of Big Brother, think of that decentralized network of different types of public actors in the system. What is the role of the state in modern day 21st century capitalism? What should we expect from it? What does it mean for the remit of our public institutions that in theory should really be governing the system towards the common good? What is the governance of the business sector, which, as we know, in so many countries and different sectors has often been structured to really kind of obsess about short-term profits and shareholder value? What's an alternative type of governance, a more purpose-driven governance? But especially, and this is what I think is really lacking in the global discourse, what is the new relationship between public and private and third sector type actors? As any of you who are in a partnership, whether you're married or not, you'll know that the word partnership should not be a lazy word. Just because you're in a partnership, it doesn't mean it's good. Sometimes partnerships can be abusive. Sometimes they can be boring. And it's the same thing with the public and the private sector. How can we really design and use design thinking to design a dynamic, creative, symbiotic, mutualistic partnership? And I think there's no time like today where we're really living through such a great challenge with the health pandemic, but also on the back of a huge challenge, which is climate change, constantly exhibiting its systems, that we need to have this rethink. And we should remember that with the health pandemic, we have really been exposed as a global kind of, structure of just how badly prepared we have been. We have made it worse than it had to be. We have not been investing globally, and it's a global pandemic, in our health systems. We haven't been reimagining the innovation within our health services that is required just as much as with the kind of drug innovation itself. We haven't been paying attention to the digital divide. So all these students globally, when they were locked down at home, didn't have an equal access to their human right to education because of the digital divide, which is only growing and only grew during COVID. And if you look at how the vaccine has been or has not been rolled out, we have really been caught empty-handed in terms of having dynamic procurement methods, for example, and rollout schemes that can make sure that we are globally vaccinated and we have global access to the vaccine. Otherwise, what we end up with is what Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, has called vaccine apartheid, a very, very powerful word. I'll repeat it: vaccine apartheid and vaccine nationalism. And the climate crisis, we need an 18-year-old Greta Thunberg to remind us, when your house is on fire, what do? Do you sit there and debate, should I go out? Should I stay in? No, you get out, and you get out fast. And the IPCC report this year, in August 2021, reminded us we better be getting out of this crisis much, much, much quicker than we have been. Already in 2019, they told us we just had 10 years left before climate breakdown would be irreversible. And that was 2 years ago. And we have not in any way globally met the targets they set out. So we have less than 8 years left. And yet, on the back of these warnings by 18-year-olds, by scientists, and so on, we are still spending in Europe every year about 55 billion euros in subsidies to fossil fuel companies. And even with COVID-19, something like 56% of the COVID-19 recovery funding was allocated to energy companies in the G20, which are still based on fossil fuel. So, I could go on. And by the way, the financial crisis was quite recent as well. So health crisis, climate crisis, financial crisis. We keep seeming to go from crisis to crisis to crisis, and last minute ask for emergency, urgent help. And all of a sudden, money appears, like it did with the financial crisis, where an immense amount of liquidity was injected into the system. Most of that liquidity ended up back into the financial sector because it was not actually accompanied with bold investments in the real world that could actually absorb that liquidity. We thought that somehow just kind of bailing out the banks and saving the financial system was enough. And this time, we cannot risk doing that. So we have different recovery schemes. In Europe, you'll know we have the Next Generation EU scheme, which I must say I have found not perfect, but much better than the recovery scheme we had after the financial crisis, where you will recall that the conditions set for member states to access that recovery was basically based on very kind of voodoo economics about deficit ratios. And there was all the debate between the Netherlands, Germany, Greece, and so on. This time around, what's very, I think, inspiring, actually, it shows a change in Europe, is that this recovery is conditional on member states having a strategy on climate change and digitalization. So already, it feels positive. However, the capacity for implementation of those strategies on the ground are very much lacking, and partly due to what Cohen was talking about, which is the kind of lack of investments that many countries have made in terms of their own public administrations. I know in Italy, where I'm from, we talk about the need for a reform of public administration, la riforma della pubblica amministrazione. Everything sounds better in Italian, but it basically just translates into very kind of false notions of efficiency metrics and basically cutting public sector wages and public sector investments, as opposed to rethinking what are the new types of civil servants that we need, what are the new capabilities, the tools, the design thinking for those tools that we need, both in the public and the private sector, in order to face together the challenges. And in many parts of the business community, we continue to have a very high degree of financialization. Something like $4 trillion have been spent over the last 10 years by Fortune 500 companies just to buy back their own shares, to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. And that kind of lack of reinvestment into the economy is one problem, which we can talk about perhaps in the Q&A. But it's not enough to reinvest. The question is, what is the direction of that investment? How can we really direct both public and private investment with ambitious goals, not micromanage them, but at least have those ambitious goals, and really to foster what some people in the business community including Paul Polman and Unilever, who's very much led this movement, call stakeholder value, not shareholder value. And, do we see that? I'm afraid not. There's lots of talk about it. And so I do think we have a problem in the financial sector where lots of the finance goes back to itself, finance, insurance, and real estate, FIRE, something like 80% of global finance. We have a problem in the business sector in many parts of the world, still stuck to just maximizing shareholder value. But we also have a big problem in government institutions that are often not as dynamic, not as flexible, not as agile, that have not been, as I've been saying, making the investments they should be making within their own organizations. And at best, framed as though they should simply be focused on fixing problems. Economists call this fixing market failures. And there are market failures. We have negative externalities like pollution, which might require carbon tax. We have positive externalities like not enough R&D spending, so governments need to fill that gap. We have information asymmetries, which might require finance for small, medium enterprises. We have coordination failures, which might need counter-cyclical investments. But the problem with the framing is that if you're simply there to fix a market failure, you are by definition always too little, too late. You actually have to wait for the market to fail or think it might fail. So to be kind of in emergency mode, as opposed to really reimagining, what do we need? What do we want? How can we achieve it together? And this is why I think it's quite useful actually to start reimagining the concept of the common good. The common good as an objective we strive for and we debate together amongst different types of stakeholders in civil society on what are we even trying to do? The sustainable development goals, what do they look like at the city level, at the regional level, at the national level? And the common good as an objective to reach, not just as a correction to fill the gap for it. Unfortunately, public goods, if you look at the kind of history in economics, has been framed too much as the correction for something that someone else is not providing versus an objective around the common good. And I'm happy to say that I've actually been speaking to the team of the Pope in the Vatican around that concept because, of course, it has its roots in deep kind of social Catholic thinking, even though I'm not religious. And I do think that anyway, it would be very wonderful if economists could broaden out their understanding of the common good. So what I do in the book called Mission Economy, a Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism, is to bring us back 51 years when we achieved something very, very difficult, much more difficult than delivering personal protection equipment to frontline workers, which we failed to do globally, which was going to the moon and back in one generation. And I'm going to tell you a bit more about that in a second. I will say right up front, because this is the pushback I get all the time, I know, and you know, that our social challenges, the societal challenges we have today, of which I've already discussed briefly, climate change, the health pandemic, or deep inequalities, which unfortunately have really been structurally embedded, which so many people in the civil rights movement continue to talk about, the Black Lives Matter movement talk about, the Me Too movement talk about. So really kind of fostering change that can tackle the deep inequalities that can be gender-based, racial-based, ethnically based, but also just the social challenges that we have around climate and so on. These are harder than going to the moon. I know that, you know that. These are what are often called wicked problems because they require not only government investment and business investment and technological change, but behavioral change, regulatory change, and a real kind of alignment across those. However, I do think that gazing back 51 years, especially now that the space race is kind of galvanizing up again, and there's lots of private actors up there, and remind me to say something about that, Elon Musk today in space and Richard Branson, how I view that. But anyway, that there's something interesting about asking, how did we get there? What did it mean for all the issues I've just mentioned? What did it mean for the governance of a public agency like NASA, of business investment? And there were so many different businesses involved across so many different sectors. It was not just aerospace. It was nutrition, materials, electronics. The whole software industry was fundamental to getting to the moon and back. And what did it mean about the way that we talked? Right? I mean, just think back to that famous Kennedy speech. He gave a couple of these, one in Rice Stadium, one in front of the Irish Parliament. He was so explicit that getting to the moon and back quickly, he set it out as a target in this generation, he said, required admitting it was going to be hard. He said, we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy. And yet think of all the language in our policymaking process, which is about de-risking someone else, facilitating someone else, which literally means making it easier in Italian and Latin, facile, right? So he said, no, we're doing it because it's hard and we're going to embrace this together. He didn't say, oh, it's hard, but we're going to make it really easy for all these businesses like Boeing and Motorola and Honeywell. No, we're going to embrace the uncertainty. And he talked about the urgent need to do it. And he said it's going to cost a lot of money. We're probably going to waste a lot of money, which they did. We will have to experiment and do lots of trial and error. And by the way, Roosevelt, with his New Deal, he talked about the art of experimentation, the need to at least try, at least give it a try. And so what does it mean to really kind of think about that welcoming of risk-taking, welcoming of experimentation, welcoming of uncertainty, sharing the difficulties, but also, as I will hopefully get to, sharing the rewards together. It's just a completely different language. And what was so interesting, when they set out on the Apollo program, they fudged it. I mean, they were kind of bullshitting. They had no idea how to get there. They finally decided on a specific way, the lunar orbit rendezvous. But first they had this way of designing how to get there, which was more direct. Then they had the Earth orbit rendezvous. So they really kind of thought through all the extremely radically different ways to get there and recognized, again, that kind of experimentation was required. And in fact, as you'll remember, on January 27th, 1967, unfortunately, there was a huge disaster, the Apollo 1 fire, as part of that trial and error. And what was so interesting, and well, tragic, obviously very tragic, but what was interesting in terms of what happened on the back of that trial and error and error and error, is that they realized that part of the problem was that the organizational structure within NASA was wrong. And Gus Grissom, one of the 3 astronauts who died on that fatal day, yelled just before the simulation module blew up, he yelled, how the hell are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? Because he couldn't hear what was being said to him in the mission control room. So the different NASA departments were badly communicating. And you'll know so many people who work in government or with government complain about each department working within its own little silo, that there's not enough kind of dynamism and horizontal integration and alignment between different departments. So on the back of that, what was interesting was that they underwent a real organizational restructure led by someone called George Mueller, who came from Bell Labs, as many of you will know, a very important private sector laboratory inside AT&T, which, by the way, was set up, sorry for these parentheses, Bell Labs was set up in an era in US history where the government was very ambitious. So in order to retain its monopoly status, AT&T had to reinvest its monopoly profits into the system, into innovation, big innovation beyond telecoms. That was the condition. Interesting. Condition on a monopoly profit. Anyway, he came in and restructured NASA to be much more communicative on the back of that accusation from Gus Grissom before dying, with project managers, each with their team, extreme delegation, dynamic teams. But the idea was constant integration between the teams, horizontal, agile, flexible communication. So like a real knowledge economy within NASA itself. And really on the back of that, on the back of a very dynamic internal structure, but also very dynamic public-private partnership and relationship with business, so many different things happened. The spillovers that occurred along the way, even if they hadn't gotten to the moon, many of these spillovers would have happened. Camera phones, athletic shoes, home insulation, foil blankets, scratch-resistant lenses. And if you've seen the movie Hidden Figures, about the role of African-American women around the data science behind the Apollo program, the software sector was almost like a spillover of that moonshot. And one thing I found so interesting, just in terms of that need for design thinking, was that Ernest Brackett, the head of procurement policy in NASA, so government as purchaser, not just as an investor, was very clear. He said basically, in order to get to the moon and back in one generation, we need to redesign these contracts. He looked at them like, this isn't going to work. And many of the procurement contracts at the time were cost plus contracts, which really could be easily gained in terms of the kind of, fees that went back to NASA. And he changed it. He said, we need contracts that are almost like prize schemes. So they were fixed price contracts with constant incentives for quality improvement and innovation. So you'd get more if you did really, really well on the kind of some sort of innovation metric. And really that was critical to fostering all these different types of innovations amongst different types of companies. Some were very large, the ones you might know like Motorola, Honeywell, and so on, but there was also smaller ones like Grumman. The other thing that I found so interesting is he even put a clause in the procurement contract between public and private of no excess profits. In other words, we're going to do this together. We're not going to turn this into a gambling casino, which I would argue space is today. It requires collective value creation. It requires market co-creation, co-shaping, not just kind of market fixing. And so we need capabilities, he argued, within NASA in order to even devise the right contracts, to know who to partner with and how to write the terms of reference. And he had a wonderful phrase that I use a lot now, especially because I'm writing a new book on consulting companies and the dominance they currently have. Anyway, I won't go into that until I write it. Invite me back. He said, if we don't invest in our own brain, if NASA doesn't invest within, and think of any public actor within its own kind of R&D and knowledge system, it will get captured, he said, by brochuremanship. So at the time, they didn't have the fancy PowerPoints we use today, but there was fancy brochures that maybe a business would bring in. And he said, we want to work with the best businesses, but we won't even know who they are if we don't know what we're doing. Right? So a civil service that is investing within its own brain, both to deliver on its own investments, but also to know who to partner with and how to devise those important contracts. And so, again, stepping back, what are the lessons for today? Of course, the moon landing was almost or mainly technological. And as I said, the challenges we have around the SDGs, just think of the main ones of zero hunger, no poverty, gender parity, quality education, and so on, just require a very bold a set of different types of policies. But they can all, I deeply believe, these 17 goals can be transformed into what I call missions, or sometimes moonshots, though the moonshot concept is sometimes problematic, but missions that are as bold as going to the moon and back, as intersectoral as the Apollo program required. Many different sectors. Just think of any sort of climate change related mission will require sectors as different as real estate, construction materials, energy, new mobility systems, new food, new urban, like new urban design and so on. So what does it mean to turn these broad challenges like clean oceans, which is SDG 14, climate change, SDG 13, into really concrete missions that we can actually answer, yes or no, did we achieve it? Because otherwise, there's what my kids call the waffling effect. You just waffle and talk about stuff and nothing happens, right? And in Europe, if you think about it, we have been waffling for a long time. We've been talking about inclusive growth, sustainable growth, smart growth, all sorts of other, in theory, inspirational directions, but we're simply not getting there. So maybe it's because we didn't have a kind of a pathway, which is not a linear pathway. There's lots of uncertainty, feedbacks, and so on, but we didn't have the right design of our policies that could be as bold as what happened with the Apollo program, where the challenge was a space race, but they transformed it into a mission, required lots of different sectors, and then key here, bottom-up projects. Right? So clean oceans could be transformed into a plastic-free ocean, which would require 20 different sectors, surely, to interact, and all sorts of very different types of projects that include both how to take out the plastic, but especially change what's going into the oceans in the first place. And, what is a mission? Of course, a mission has to be bold and inspirational to galvanize as much, public and private sector investment. But the question of who decides what that bold mission is, I think, a big question mark. And I'm sure there'll be some questions on that. And I have recently been working at the city level, and cities are interesting because it's also easier to work with different groups in civil society on missions, for example, that might be framing the climate change challenge at the level, for example, of social housing and housing estates, where then we can use, resident associations and civil assemblies, civic assemblies, citizen assemblies, to really be brought at the table in the first place, to actually think about and design and have a voice at the table instead of just being told by an academic or a policymaker or a business that it's an important thing to do. Missions need to be designed in such a way that really do foster that intersectoral innovation. So to do that, it has to be clear, but very open on the how. If you tell everyone what to do or think it's all within one sector, you've already kind of killed that really dynamic spillover kind of effect that the moon landing had across so many different sectors. So clear on the targets, design that procurement process, grants, loans, etc., in such a way to be target-oriented, but very open on the how in order to really foster that bottom-up experimentation. And I think this is quite important in the Netherlands, where you have for many years now had this kind of top sector approach, or the UK has had what they call the key sector approach. In the UK, the key sectors used to be, God, what were they? Aerospace, automobiles, finance, creative industry, life sciences, and the financial sector. And my message really to governments is, really, who came up with that list? Really what we should be choosing are not a random list of pet project or maybe the back of lobbying sectors, but again, these broad challenges. And with the UK government, I worked very closely actually with Greg Clark, who is the Minister of Innovation, and together working also across the government, we came up with these 4 challenges of clean growth, it's not rocket science, future of mobility, the aging society, and AI and the data economy, and really worked hard then to transform each and every one of these into different types of missions, like one around future of mobility, which included one mission around a transport system that would be 100% accessible, 100% accessible by people with any form of with hopefully any form of disability. Sometimes it's harder than other times, but that would foster again that bottom-up innovation also with this incredibly dynamic sector, which is assistant technologies, really focused on different ways of going up a ramp instead of thinking that there's only one kind of linear way. And that idea of an industrial strategy, which continues to require, for example, horizontal policies, which we should remember are the basic policies we, of course, still need on education, basic R&D funding, science industry linkages, and so on, but that the vertical policies, which in the past were sector-based, technology-based, where we obsess about particular technologies and then get there and it's too late, or even company-based, around notions, for example, about small, medium enterprises, to transform that vertical notion away from these categories to the challenges and the mission. So really what missions are doing is transforming the vertical into a challenge and mission-oriented approach versus the sector approach. But that doesn't mean you don't need the horizontal investments. And I just say that because that's sometimes misunderstood. We still need kind of blue sky science and so on. But the challenge-oriented notion of inclusive, sustainable growth needs to also be changed so it's not so fuzzy and doesn't just remain at that very broad level, as well as our industrial choices should really be galvanizing innovation across every single sector. And just on that, I found it very interesting that when in Germany, they really started to focus a lot on climate change and really in a big energy transformation, it required then their own institutions within the public sector to change, because a mission-oriented approach requires change. Otherwise, what's the point of talking about, missions or some other form of policy like smart growth? And what it required was imposing conditionality on the types of loans, for example, that the public bank, the KfW, gave to sectors that were coming to the government asking for help. And one such sector was the steel sector, which you will know globally has been asking governments for help, both pre and post-COVID. And they created a condition that in order to meet that kind of high-level mission that the government set itself around carbon neutrality, the steel sector had to lower its material content in order to get 1 penny or euro of government funding, which they did through repurpose, reuse, recycle technology throughout the whole value chain, to the point that Germany today has the greenest, most sustainable steel production. It's not a very sexy sector, not because they went to Davos and talked about stakeholder value, but because they had to. And that level of conditionality, I think, is again really interesting right now with COVID, because some countries, not all, definitely not the UK, have imposed conditionalities with the kind of bailout and recovery schemes, very much in some ways in line with this EU Next Gen conditionality about member states having to have a strategy around climate and digitalization. So in France, both Renault and Air France had to lower their carbon emissions or commit to lowering their carbon emissions over the next 5 years in order to get a piece of the recovery fund. In Denmark and Austria, companies have to commit to stop evading tax and using tax havens. You know, again, not rocket science, but that kind of conditionality in the past was, as I mentioned, forcing countries, for example, to lowering their deficits. But this new type of conditionality, both between public and private, is, I think, a moment to rethink the social contract. Because these are contracts, right? Every loan, every grant, every procurement scheme has a written contract somewhere. And there's something about, if we are purpose-led and mission-oriented, what is the new organizational structure that can be, again, target-oriented, but very dynamic and open to kind of welcoming that kind of agility and flexibility I talked about, but especially to foster the bottom-up experimentation, but also the new design of the contracts themselves. And, I'll just say one last thing because my time is up. The health pandemic is no better place to look at how things can go wrong. The vaccine is absolutely a result of the 6 vaccines. We have 6 different vaccines of a result of both public and private investment in different types of institutions. The EIB was actually also funding some of this work, but Oxford University, these were publicly financed researchers, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna, the NIH, National Institutes of Health, which put in $40 billion a year in health innovation, have also been critical for lots of the early stage investments, including DARPA, by the way, with the mRNA technology. So on the back of both public and private investment, what is the right governance structure for a vaccine during a health pandemic, which is a global pandemic, where we're only as healthy as our neighbor is? And we have failed miserably to govern the intellectual property rights in a way with conditionality. Don't forget, patents are a contract between the state and the private sector. You get 20-year monopoly profits. And what should be the right kind of conditionality and design to make sure that those patents lead to what William Baumol, a late wonderful economist, used to call productive as opposed to unproductive entrepreneurship? Because unfortunately today, patents are too wide, they're too strong, they're too upstream. So we're actually patenting the tools for research, which is not what patents are for. So how to restructure the patent system to really foster collective intelligence instead of private rent seeking would be one of the many design changes that we need within the contracts to foster what I call this kind of mission-oriented, common good, purpose-oriented approach. My time is up, so I will now shut up and hopefully be able to engage with you, and the technology will work. But thank you very much. And I think the Netherlands actually should be congratulated for really being a leader in many ways around this mission-oriented approach on the back of some criticism it received from others, including myself, around this top sector approach. Because I know you've, for example, been galvanizing a lot of discussion that's more interdisciplinary around your science and innovation strategy, and listen to some of the critiques that you've received from some social scientists and those in the humanities. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this very inspiring lecture. And I am very happy to open the floor for questions from both the audience here in the theater and also to open the digital floor for questions in the live stream. And because I do not see anyone yet at one of the 3 microphones, I am going to ask Marietje to open the Q&A by posing the first question.
Thank you very much. Hi, Mariana. I don't know if you can see me or us, but we can see you loud and clear, and it was a great, great talk. Thank you. More applause is coming. When I engage in discussions around technology policy, as you know I do, we often hear that China is leading with a top-down approach to governing technology. The US leaves a lot of space to the market, and the EU, even leaders in the EU, pride themselves on being super regulators. And the EU is now proposing an AI strategy that has this risk-based approach to artificial intelligence and is really a first mover, if you want to consider it that, in laying down the rules to govern technology. Do you see this sort of super regulator approach to technology in the EU as a mission, or is there work to be done there?
Thank you so much, and we should let the audience know that we are also buddies in cold water swimming, which will always be my memory of wonderful times with you. So thanks so much for the question, and also for your work, because you're really a global leader around thinking of exactly that question. First of all, I think it's really important to debunk the whole kind of China-US difference. I often say that China is learning what the US actually did, as opposed to what it says it did, at the same time that the US is unlearning it. And this really held true, I think, up until recently. I do think Biden is changing that. But China actually, through, for example, due to its urgent challenge that it has now with pollution, has been investing much more than many parts of the world in this kind of climate transition pre-COVID. So everything should be compared pre-COVID, given that money seems to be coming out of the trees now. But pre-COVID, they had their $5 trillion investment strategy to green the entire economy, including around energy-friendly technologies and so on, and really started to form new types of institutions that would interact within the market, including the Chinese Development Bank, which provided very patient loans to dynamic companies, including in other sectors. By the way, Huawei. Huawei would not exist without a massive loan that it got, guaranteed loan. I think it was $7 billion from the Chinese Development Bank. But that kind of decentralized network of public institutions that were required to get a Silicon Valley is what I've called the entrepreneurial state in the past. And what's interesting in the US is they talk like Thomas Jefferson, but they actually have acted like Andrew Hamilton, right? Everyone knows Hamilton now because of the musical, but Hamilton was a political leader 100 years ago who really promoted industrial strategy, whereas Jefferson, at least how he talked, was more about, yes, some basic stuff the government needs to do, but then the market will provide. And so the fact that the US has kind of talked one thing but walked another is, I think, a real opportunity right now from the US to actually talk the walk and walk the talk, which is to learn how do we actually not only admit that the state is important, but rethink these state institutions like DARPA, like the National Institutes of Health, like ARPA-E, which on the one hand, yes, they're important, but they're not always governed around public good issues. I already mentioned the NIH, huge investments in drug innovation, and then the prices are just simply set by large pharmaceutical companies without taking into account that public contribution. So there is a whole opportunity to admit what the US model really was, as opposed to insinuating what you mentioned, which is describing it as a market model, but also to really understand what's happening in China, because I think the danger in China is that currently they have big pots of money coming from entities like the Chinese Development Bank, and that's not yet as dynamic and decentralized across the whole innovation chain as the US model. So it'll be interesting to see what learning happens there. In the EU, you called it kind of this regulatory approach. I think what's really important when we talk about market shaping and not just market fixing is always to look at the regulation as part and parcel of the creation of wealth in the first place. I often say you can't just worry ex post about redistribution or regulation. You need to get the conditions right in the first place through a pre-distribution kind of lens. So by really thinking through this kind of purpose orientation and getting the conditions right between public and private sectors, sharing risks, but also sharing rewards and having common good objectives for the innovation itself, I actually think the role of regulation will be able to be much more proactive and less reactive. And in the area of digital and big tech that you have contributed so importantly on, there's no other area that makes this such an important problem. When you look at, the internet, GPS, a lot of these technologies, including driverless cars today, a lot of the kind of nanotech and AI has been on the back of public funding, and then we just assumed that we could almost kind of be hands-off on it. And I think that what we need in Europe, where there is a lot of public money going on the investment side, is to start asking, how can we bring innovation policy and competition policy and regulatory policy more together instead of seeing them in completely different domains? And by the way, Joseph Schumpeter, who you'll know is seen to be one of the big innovators or thinkers around innovation, most of what he said on innovation, Marx already said. He wasn't really that new. But what he said about competition policy was new. And I won't go into the details because I should be a bit more brief here, but the real need to rethink how we understand competition, how we want to drive competition to have a healthy kind of diversity of different actors, but also competition not just in terms of the quantity theory of competition, so size of big actors like big tech, but really understanding how value is being created and co-created in the first place, and to even be able to distinguish what I talk about in my previous book, The Value of Everything, value extraction from value creation. That discussion needs to be had in the competition authorities themselves. And so algorithms, which you talk about a lot, what are algorithmic rents? How can we distinguish how Google and Amazon have been using algorithms for rent seeking versus a lot of what they were doing in the early days, which I would describe in a new project we actually have around this, which was actually much more about increasing the diversity of the supplier base by allowing all the different types of suppliers to surface up on the web versus what we see today, which is that what you're seeing, as Shoshana Zuboff argues, is what kind of Google and Amazon want you to see, as opposed to that much more creative ecosystem that the platform was designed to deliver in the early days. So that kind of value creation, value extraction, helping to redesign our algorithms themselves versus just picking up the mess later. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Mariana, I don't know if you can see the theater, but in the meantime, some people have come forward to ask questions, and I'm going to ask you to keep them very brief so that we can take as many questions as possible. And indeed, it would be great if you could also keep the answers brief so we can have as many people ask questions as we can. I would like to start over here, so please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Mazzucato, for your inspiring talk, but also for your inspiring ideas. I have a question about competition policy, because you talked about designing a new system, designing a new economy. And competition policy has the promise or the power to be a very important tool in that new design, but unfortunately it often isn't. And to me it seems like there's a few things standing in the way. The law, lawyers, jurisprudence are sort of conservative thresholds we have to overcome to get into the world you are designing for us. So have you seen any good examples of how to break through those thresholds? Do you have any ideas how to overcome the law, lawyers, jurisprudence, to get to a place where we can design the economy we want?
Great question. So should I take them each one by one? And I'll be brief. It's probably better because it's so hot here, by the way. If you see me doing this, it's because summer has finally arrived very late in London. It's like very hot, 30 degrees. So first of all, I wouldn't talk about the lawyers, right? It's the law and different forms of law and legal contracts define the kind of, as I mentioned in the beginning, market outcomes we have. There's a wonderful book, by the way, called The Code of Capital by Caterina Pistor, which I think does one of the best, it's a great work on some of these issues. And so breaking down and highlighting the problematic contracts that I mentioned before, where we often end up socializing risks, privatizing rewards, but also the algorithms themselves, patents, intellectual property rights, they're all founded upon legal arrangements, and kind of elevating them up to the surface and rethinking them is absolutely required. So I think it's a really good point that you've made, but it's not about saying the lawyers are the problem. It's actually about asking what is the new type of legal contract that would be more functional, less dysfunctional, if we care about things like collective intelligence. And again, I really think under the current health pandemic, where we've seen a lot of extractive behavior, even during this crisis where such a large part of the world still doesn't have access to the vaccine, it's not just lack of solidarity, it's also founded on certain types of legal contracts. So where it's interesting, I do think, something that would be fascinating would be to start unpicking projects and to start learning what works, what doesn't. Again, coming to the vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine has a specific kind of contract with the researchers, very different from the Pfizer one. And it's not a coincidence that Pfizer is one of the most financialized companies in the world. I don't know if anyone in Pfizer is in the room. In terms of share buybacks, only Exxon, I think, is worse. And so it's not a coincidence that such a financialized company didn't agree to certain types of legal relationships and contracts that were in some ways being requested by those who cared about issues like vaccine equity and so on. So again, it's not about the lawyers and the law, it's what are we trying to do and unpick what we need in terms of the contracts, the law, the legal system. And remember, the market itself is an outcome of that. There's nothing inevitable or deterministic.
Thank you. Go ahead, please, here in front of the theater.
Yes, thank you. Good evening. My name is Marco Swan. I actually also have a question about legal stuff, about the law, but from a different perspective. Currently in the Netherlands, but also in Europe as a whole, we're seeing citizens bringing lawsuits to businesses and governments to make sure that they keep their sustainability commitments. And I was wondering, what are the role of the courts in achieving your new form of capitalism? So not law or lawyers or the legal system as a barrier to sustainability, like the previous question suggested, but as part of the driving force to actually achieve the sustainability commitments that are being made. Thank you so much.
It's a great question, but you guys must think I'm a lawyer or something, because I don't know. But no, I mean, if you think of what's been happening over time with the ESG, right, these environmental, social kind of governance kind of targets that businesses, whether it's Unilever or other companies that talk a lot about stakeholder value and this need for new metrics, the problem is that they haven't been mandatory. You can't have the kind of transformation we need around sustainable and inclusive growth if it's just up to kind of random reporting. As soon as you start creating mandatory types of reporting and disclosure, and by the way, in the world of the digital platforms, one thing that's not disclosed at all is kind of segmented reporting. So you'll have Facebook or Amazon have lots of different markets that they're serving, and there's no kind of segmented reporting. And that's actually where you see a lot of what's going on. So in that world, if you made it mandatory legally, that segmented reporting was required. If the ESG targets were really rigorous, standardized, systemic, and mandatory, and if also those same targets required us to look at the real ecosystem, so these kind of public-private relationships, and having metrics that could capture whether we have a symbiotic versus a parasitic relationship in a sector, that itself would be quite useful. But that legal issue, I think, is really about transforming what is currently in many different parts of the economy of voluntary reporting in order to be more sustainable, to being legally demanding and mandatory. We would start seeing capital flows change quite radically, I think, in terms of the kinds of businesses that are getting financed.
Thank you.
But civic action has always been important too. We shouldn't forget, just in case I do forget, the reason we all benefit from the weekend, the 8-hour workday, holidays, is because of labor unions. Trade unions fought for that. People died to give us the weekend. Not a bad social innovation. What is the next kind of form of weekend, but what are the kind of movements and social movements that always tend to come before big legal and government changes? And I think today we're living in a world with, again, the Fridays for the Future, the Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, and these should all be seen as part and parcel of shaping capitalism to be more just. And on the back of that, hopefully we'll see real legal changes, but the movements need to also be welcomed, and we need to make sure we're not tokenistically, condescendingly tapping the Gretas on the head and then ignoring them, but really listening. And that requires more empathy, even within government training. So a listening exercise.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to take the window of opportunity you provided for changing the subject from legal issues to the social movements, because we also have various questions coming in from the live stream, and someone, anonymous, is asking, we're forced to debate our house being on fire because some don't believe it is. So if there is fundamental disagreement on common facts, how can we come to a definition of common good? So despite seeing these social movements of people who agree on what the common good or what their common good is, we have fundamental disagreements about common facts. So how can we still come to that definition of common good?
Well, it's really interesting. And, you know, I know in the UK, I don't know how it is there in the Netherlands, but there's been this really dysfunctional situation, which only recently has started to change, where the BBC, our public broadcaster, every time they even used the word climate change until recently, and brought in someone, a top scientist who would, you know, reveal all sorts of, you know, information, knowledge, and facts about climate change, it always had to be counterweighted by, frankly, some lunatic denying it. So this idea of, you know, that we had to have a measured debate without actually defining what does it mean to have, you know, contestation in a real way, really informed by, yes, different opinions, but at least to, you know, listen to the science, as again, Greta always says, and to allow the scientific and the evidence, which itself sometimes is contrasting. It's not that all scientists are saying the same thing, but to really have that kind of weight to inform our, you know, thinking. It's just amazing how it's just been so messy, and unfortunately citizens have not benefited from that, because if it's not your area, you're just kind of listening to the radio or the TV and often getting very confused. So I don't think it had to be how it is, where we've given such a strong voice to kind of, you know, deniers, not just of climate change, but of a lot of other types of areas that have been informed by science. And by the way, you know, my kind of rant sometimes about consulting companies, that's part and parcel of this kind of de-expertization of the economy, where you have, you know, organizations like McKinsey and Deloitte and so on, you know, informing policy without necessarily really having knowledge. I mean, we had Deloitte, one of the big four consulting companies, run the UK test and trace system. That is not their expertise, I can tell you that. So it's not just about climate deniers, is where is the room today for experts of different types, which might also disagree amongst themselves, but for science and informed thinking and discussion, when we have actually been valuing this thing, which I would, you know, refer back to Ernest Brackett and NASA, when he called it just brochuremanship. So it's both about, you know, denial of something as big as climate change, but also really stepping back and trying to understand what is the role today of knowledge, of the way we digest information, of what information is also accessible, how it's being framed. And it's just, you know, an incredibly confusing situation, but it doesn't have to be. And it doesn't mean that the scientists should just top down tell everyone how it is, but it is an opportunity for social sciences, for humanities and natural sciences to also question the role of expertise and how to deliver it in a way that is also more understandable and more related to also civic spaces.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. And I very much look forward towards your new book on the consultancies. I kept someone waiting on my left hand for a very long time, so please go ahead.
And you talked a lot about organizational changes, institutional changes that are required to tackle the challenges that you talked about. If you look at the Netherlands, the current politics, it's quite a mess, even though our institutional setup and we have quite a good, well-functioning liberal democracy. And so my question relates a little bit to the question, do you think that the current generation of politicians is fit to take up these challenges? And that's question one. And then as a follow-up question, what kind of leadership do you think is needed to take up these kind of challenges?
It's interesting that you got an applause. By the way, it's getting very dark in here, so I'm going to stand up just for a second and turn on the lights. Sorry, but I can talk. I'm a multitasker. Women can do more than one thing at once. Men need MBAs to learn how to do more than one thing. No one is laughing at me. Okay, fine. So I don't know about the politician's question because, I'm from Italy where, of course, we've had a political mess in many different eras. The UK right now is in a complete political mess, and you've just told me that the Netherlands is. But it's not necessarily about politicians. Just like in the private sector, there's many problems with different types of CEOs or managers. There's different types of problems with different politicians. The question for me, at least with government, is what is the remit in the first place? If we don't have strong concepts of public value and public purpose, and the role of government itself is, again, at best, as fixing, a market failure here and there, we need to ask ourselves, how does that inform who wants to work in government, but especially the cultures within our government institutions that ironically make it even more open to capture and corruption if it's not really clear what you're for. And we just did a report for the BBC because the BBC has been thinking a lot about public value, right? So whereas public broadcasting in the United States, they bought into this notion of the public sector just fixing a market failure, so they do documentaries and high quality news. The BBC also did soap operas. It also did talk shows. But it decided how to do soap operas and talk shows with this idea of needing to push the frontier, really kind of, coming back to the SDGs, having kind of a goal around diversity, around equity, around, really helping people have greater empathy. So think of EastEnders instead of Dallas and Dynasty. I'm sure you're all too young to know what the hell I'm talking about, but these were soap operas in the US, very much about the rich and powerful versus EastEnders, a soap opera award-winning on the working class. That required an institution, public institution like the BBC, to push the frontier of what soap operas were even for. And I think there's an implication of that for politics and politicians too. That if we were really clear that you should only get into politics if you're really interested in transformational change, and the discussion has to be on your kind of both theory, but what you think is then required in order to get there, right? And that your policies and the way you even frame your election manifesto should be, as concrete as something like the Green Deal, but then being very specific on how you think we should get there. That would be very different from what we currently have. And especially if we design our public institutions that are not politicized. The reason DARPA is so successful is it's public but not politicized. In Italy, we had this public institution called IRI, la Istituzione della Ricostruzione Italiana. It, was responsible early on for constructing the whole motorway in Italy from north to south. It did it in just 4 years, but it had 3 different phases. Public and not politicized, very ambitious, attracting top managers, top people. It was an honor to work in IRI. Second phase was public and totally politicized. Just like, Alitalia and RAI all became politicized. Each party got its little chunk, its slice of the public pie. And the third stage was privatized, which was a complete disaster. They ended up cutting all their public investment, just like Telecom Italia cut all its research and development once it was privatized. And I think the lesson is interesting. It just shows you it's not about public or private. It's not that politicians or the public sector is slower or more open to capture than the private sector. It is about governance. And so a lot of these questions, what does it mean to set up public but not politicized institutions that aren't, just slaves to the electoral cycle? So everyone's just pitching the next, big pet idea without that kind of longevity and cumulativity that you require. And learning about these organizational issues that we talked about, that actually could transform how politics kind of rolls itself out, because it is no longer kind of enslaved to electoral cycle kind of thinking, which ironically brings in short-termism, which I already said was a problem in the private sector, into the public sector. There's a lot of short-termism in the public sector. But I know many inspirational people in politics, and I think the problem is that they're depressed. If you are constantly being positioned against this like funky, creative private sector, and your big role is to de-risk the private sector, that kind of stuff I talked about in the beginning of welcoming risk-taking, experimentation, learning, creativity. It's not enough just to say it in a talk like I'm doing here today to you. We need to embed that within the organizational culture, but even the contracts. Today, when civil servants make a mistake, they are slammed on the front page of the Daily Mail. Whereas, the Elon Musks can brag about all the failure because they're seen as that's part of their success. Because when the successes happen, the story is told about that success. And I think there has been a really problematic storytelling, but also problematic government structures. I'm not there to defend government. I truly believe we have the wrong kind of politics, the wrong kind of public sector because of this misinformed notion of the role of the state in the 21st century. And that's why I've set up a whole institute in London, which is also about the training, the new curriculum, the new mindset. Most public policy programs, the masters in public administrations, where many politicians also sometimes begin, if they're not doing PPE at Oxford type institutions, they're driven by this old school Chicago type economics, which has its ramifications around public choice theory and new public management, which has actually convinced many civil servants that government failure is even worse than market failure.
Mariana.
So, sorry. I could go on.
I know, but our Q&A is already running a little late and beyond schedule, and there are some very patient people here who would still like to briefly ask a question. So my proposal would be that we still take the question from Dirk, and that we take the question on my right hand, so 2 more, and then I'm very, very sorry, but I really have to close this Q&A. So Dirk, please take the floor.
Thank you. Hi, Mariana. Thanks for your persuasive talk. And I can't imagine any bureaucrat or politician or businessman or woman not wanting to go ahead and do it. But then when we look out of the window, the world is different, apparently. What is the very short question? What do you think is the biggest barrier to this kind of transformation?
I think, that's a big question. I should think about it before just spewing out an answer. But one of them is definitely the need to reimagine. This idea, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I really think it's the biggest barrier. This idea that actually we're there, to fill the gap in different areas versus reimagine. Reimagining the welfare state. Imagine if we actually cared about using as a funnel for innovation, all the different types of social and public services we have, including the organizations like public libraries, community centers, youth centers. That's about reimagining the welfare state itself instead of this constant dichotomy. So the bottleneck is the dichotomy between innovation, wealth creation, entrepreneurship here, and then all the things that we care about, including caring and social care and health care, education for our kids here. I think the really interesting, and this is also something I really want to dedicate the next decade to, what does it look like when we bring together our understandings of wealth creation and entrepreneurship and how we think about care and a caring economy and a sustainable economy, and actually literally bring not only the people in the same room, but actually start using the design thinking that I've been talking about to really transform and because we're living through a health pandemic, let me just focus again on care, right? And I think the fact that even just like last night, I was at this dinner set up by Google, the CFO of Google was visiting London, and all the people around the room, who did they invite? They invited the venture capitalists and people like me, because I'm seen as, I don't know why they invited me, to be honest, and all these kind of tech companies. There weren't any nurses, there weren't any school teachers, right? So I just think that in terms of the challenges we face, whether it's on the digital divide or stronger health systems, around inequality, around climate, and we have to break down this ridiculous dichotomy that we've created around who should be in the room.
Thank you. We have room for one last very brief question, and then if I may ask you one very brief answer. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm not sure if this is short. Thank you for a very interesting evening. And I'm sorry to whoever was at the front. I'll buy you a beer. You said if you only fix market failures, you're by definition doing too little, too late. I think that couldn't be more true. And you've also talked a lot about private and public, but I was wondering, what's your vision on public-private companies in the middle, like TSOs, the transmission system operators? I think it's National Grid in the UK, here it's called TenneT. Yeah, with crucial roles in the energy transition, and could have a huge role in this creation, but they're also the most heavily regulated and most complex, multi-layered governance, as someone said 2 questions ago on governance. Yeah, with that, because of that regulation, now not only doing too little, too late by definition, but by regulation, even if they wanted to. So I was wondering, what's your vision on those companies in between, what their role could be?
That's a really interesting way to frame it, companies in between. It's a really important question, which, by the way, is different from, but connected to also to very problematic state aid rules, I think we have, which also are another kind of issue around problematic regulation, which I think is informed by problematic understandings of what it is that should be the conditions in terms of transformation. So I'll just give you an example also to talk about Africa, perhaps, because, you know, there are different continents and we have to get out of our Eurocentric mindset sometimes. In South Africa, where I'm currently advising the president of South Africa through a whole council, including people like Danny Roderick, has, you know, a very large state-owned company, a state-owned enterprise called Eskom, or I'm actually on the board of a half state-owned enterprise called Enel in Italy. And, you know, one of the interesting issues that are parallel to the public-private kind of conditionality is, what is the public conditionality? Which in some ways you're alluding to, like what should be the condition for a semi-public entity to actually get those public funds. I mean, Eskom, for example, which is well known for having issues around corruption and capture and so on, what would be the required transformation of its own governance, but also its regulation by the South African government, but also the funding it receives from the Treasury if it becomes a key input and actor into an energy transition. So I think one of the problems with answering your question is, if there isn't a clear vision and strategy in a government or in a region or in a city, then the answer to your question is much, much harder. If we have clear ambitions around energy transition, sustainable growth, and so on, how can we make sure that the regulation itself, in that same way that, you know, Ernest Brackett thought of procurement, which, by the way, is a huge component of government budgets, often 4 times as large as the whole innovation budget in countries, how can we actually devise procurement, but also regulatory practices to be not just about kind of what not to do, and in some ways ending up stifling innovation, but really creating the boundaries and the constraints, but the incentives for innovation itself towards kind of common good metrics. And I could say more about that, but I do think that kind of parallel between how to redesign procurement and redesigning kind of regulation in order to foster innovation, as opposed to just kind of create, you know, conditions of what not to do, can really be informed by these new ideas that I think we need around the common good. And I go back to issues around regulating health innovation around common good practices. But anyway, they said I had to be brief, and I think I need to be brief.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Mariana Mazzucato.
Thank you so much for all the questions and everyone in the audience.
Thank you so much, Mariana, for taking the time to inspire us, but I think definitely also to challenge us, many of us as politicians. We will most certainly keep following up on her work. Of course, we also have a thank you present, which we will be sending over to London. Well, it is time for the second part of this evening, starting a little later than scheduled, but I know you don't mind. we are very happy that we will be able to continue the conversation with two very creative and also critical minds on the future of the Dutch digital economy and society. So Marietje Schaake and Dirk Bezemer will each shortly deliver a response to the Marchant lecture we've just heard from Professor Mazzucato. And afterwards we will have another brief Q&A with the both of them. And once again, I would very much like to invite you to ask your questions either here or via the live stream. It is my great pleasure to announce Marietje Schaake. Marietje Schaake is a leading voice on the governance and regulation of technology. She currently works as International Policy Director at the Cyber Policy Center of Stanford University, and she is also a fellow at the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. Moreover, Marietje Schaake is a senior advisor for the Eurasia Group on Tech and Geopolitics. And to many of you, she is well known as a former member of the European Parliament for D66, during which she became a highly influential figure in shaping Europe's tech and trade policies. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you all again in person. I hope this is what you came for after spending so much time online. A bit of a challenge of how long you can keep your concentration, but I promise I'll be brief. It's really an honor and a pleasure to follow Mariana, and I truly look forward to listening to Dirk's remarks after this as well. The vision that was expressed in this very energetic talk, and which is also laid out in the manifesto, the mission economy, it's really inviting and attractive. The proposition is contagious because who does not want the state to be more entrepreneurial, for bureaucracies to passionately collaborate, and to lead to good outcomes? To facilitate change instead of just responding to it, to reform capitalism, and to harbor the digital revolution in a way that does not lead to a wholesale outsourcing of governance and power to Silicon Valley companies. I wholeheartedly share Mariana Mazzucato's urge to strengthen the public interest, the ability of governments to create the societies that respond to people's needs, as well as those of the planet, and to foster cooperation towards a shared goal that makes miracles like flying to the moon possible. However, I am left with a number of reflections that may shed a slightly more dim light on the very bright mission economy vision. Let me start with the aspect of geopolitics. The Apollo mission, after all, was in no small part motivated by the geopolitical race and the American ambition to outpace the then Soviet Union. The creation of the space program was very much a tactical move during the Cold War in an effort to show the United States' technological superiority. And the idea was that future leadership belonged to the people who would master science and technology. It's an argument that is not that dissimilar to what we hear today about the race for technological dominance, the new Cold War. President Putin has said about artificial intelligence, and I quote, "Artificial intelligence is the future, not only for Russia, but for all humankind. It comes with colossal opportunities, but also threats that are difficult to predict. Whoever becomes the leader in this sphere will become the ruler of the world." And back in 2018, the Chinese government laid out a top-level artificial intelligence plan in which it announced, quote, "By 2030, we shall make artificial intelligence theory, technology, and application at the world's leading level." Now, in the United States, currently, and I'm surrounded by the US debate, even if it is online, one of the main missions seems to be to prevent China from succeeding, though I doubt whether strengthening the public interest is a leading objective for the various investments and public-private partnerships that are fostered with this latest geopolitical and national security push in mind. One of the biggest proponents of strengthening investments in technology is the whole group of CEOs of tech companies. Now, competition, but also wars, have historically led to generous investments to shape technological advances, and they continue to do so until today. Though the aspiration of a mission economy sounds more attractive than that of aspiring to win a war. In some ways, the mission economy could be dubbed the national security economy, though, because we would be able to trace billions of investments into cutting-edge technologies like lenses, robotics, biometrics, and drones back to military missions and defense research and development. Today, in no small part, the revival of industrial policies in the European Union can be explained by a growing concern of the system's competition with China and the need to be less dependent on others for the production of semiconductors, deep computing, or digital supply chains. So, looking through the mission lens may be considered the mission of European technological sovereignty. I'm not that optimistic about its landing, but it is a mission. The second reflection. The intrinsic motivation towards defining and achieving a mission in reality is more often a shared crisis or the purpose to survive. It may not be less powerful, and certainly urgency to act and to come together are frequently forged when needing to act against an outside force. The EU has now famously made its biggest strides during crises, and this very country may not have been the global leader in water management had it not been for the need to survive against the rising seawater over and over again. The recent testing of the room for the river model to manage the water with carefully phased steps and allowing rivers to flood into the lands without forming a risk reminds us of ongoing efforts and innovations. Dikes have been moved, rivers diverted, channels deepened, all as part of a project spanning more than 40 locations. But do we see this project as a mission that government has enthusiastically got people behind, spending billions of euros, or was part of its success the invisible and steady effort which led to a quiet victory only when truly tested during the recent floods? Crises do not automatically lead to a shared mission. In fact, the COVID-19 pandemic tested our systems with much poorer results. The preparedness across the EU, for example, left a lot to wish for, and cooperation was often replaced with competition. But later, common efforts towards the vaccines turned out to be more fruitful. The EU's Green Deal and a broader sustainability agenda sound like a no-brainer for the next mission. It's also one that Mariana highlights in her book and one that resonates with many of you who are here together. Truly a mission that the entire globe could get behind, but won't. And that brings me to my third reflection: politics. Mission economy highlights many powerful examples from the United States and the United Kingdom, and then also a few from the EU. But the power and authority of the executives differs quite significantly between them. Countries without a strong executive or a single party having significant governance power will have to balance missions with coalitions. As we witness every day, the tendency is more fragmentation politically, and therefore more slices made to divide the pie. And everybody claims to act in the name of the common good. The much desired coalition accord on a single piece of paper along many points has never materialized in this country, and I really would be surprised if it does this year. Driven by the need to be recognizable to voters, differences are in fact magnified, and individual party successes are celebrated instead of working together towards a shared success. And as such, the battle to define any mission, priorities large or small, is part and parcel of our lively and democratic, albeit sometimes difficult, debate. Even if our Polder model was born out of the collaboration and balancing of interests in the battle against floods, the political equivalent slows down bold ambitions almost invariably. So in conclusion, and given these brief reflections, I will leave you with the following thoughts. Firstly, do not underestimate the driving force of geopolitics. It shaped the mission around the Apollo 11 launch and also shapes key decisions around investments today. Secondly, do not underestimate the quiet successes of existing missions. How many Dutch people today will celebrate that hundreds of millions of euros will be invested in quantum computing so that we might play a global role in the production of this high-tech, innovative technology in the future? We will only truly know in a couple of years what the results will be. Thirdly, do not underestimate the emergence of crises as a motivating force to unite people behind a shared mission, not out of idealism, but out of necessity. And fourthly, do not underestimate the power of politics and democratic compromise as a countervailing force holding back the appeal of a strong and shared mission that government or societies unite behind. Missions end up being driven by context, geopolitical, political, as well as crises such as the pandemic, climate change, or the digital revolution. So in light of all this, perhaps one of the main missions that different political parties can agree about is the need to modernize and reform democratic party politics itself. I'm pretty sure that many of the stakeholders, citizens like you, cannot wait.
Thank you so much, Marietje, for this critical outlook, I think, on the mission economy and also on its potential for success. I think you reminded us of some very important issues. Before we go to the Q&A, I would like to invite Dirk Bezemer to deliver his 15-minute response to the Marchant lecture we have just heard. So please make your way.
Yep.
Dirk Bezemer is a professor of economics of international financial development at the University of Groningen. And in the past, he provided policy advice to, amongst other institutions, the OECD, the World Bank, and the European Union. He specializes in finance, growth and development, and monetary economics. And aside from his academic work, he also writes a bi-weekly column for the Groene Amsterdammer. And last year, he published the book Een land van kleine buffers, roughly translating to a country of low buffers, or perhaps even better, a country of money managers, as you write in your book, in which he argues that there is enough money, we just need to spend it differently. Dirk Bezemer is also a member of the Sustainable Finance Lab. Dirk, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Afgan. Thank you very much. I'm honored to respond to this persuasive, heartwarming, and doable challenge that we just heard from Mariana Mazzucato. And I will use a few minutes to reflect on what is it that needs to change when she talks about a moonshot guide to changing capitalism. What capitalism? What capitalism is it that needs changing? And I want to apply this especially to the Netherlands, building on the work that I've done when I wrote that book last year. Because we are here in the Netherlands, so does this apply to us? The American economist Hyman Minsky has suggested a historical sequence of types of capitalism, from Renaissance capitalism and including industrial capitalism, finance capitalism, state-led capitalism, welfare state capitalism, and now we've come to a stage that he called money manager capitalism. Money manager capitalism. That's the kind of capitalism of market economy where it's no longer the captains of industry who are the leading role models and who hold all economic power, as in classical capitalism of the late 19th and early 20th century. We've also left behind the mixed economy type of capitalism, where government and industry as equal partners co-create economic security and innovative products, such as Apollo in Mazzucato's talk. This happened in the mixed economy of the 1950s and 60s. But since the 1980s, we've come to this new kind of capitalism called money manager capitalism, where government and work and entrepreneurship all take a backseat to the financial markets. Economic power nowadays lies with the managers of investment funds like BlackRock and Vanguard and the big investment banks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. Economic dynamics nowadays are dominated by real estate markets and asset purchase programs and pension concerns. They're all financial values, they're not real values. The money managers who had the big investment funds are now emulated and imitated across society and in the economy. So what is it that these money managers do? What is the essence of money manager capitalism? They accumulate money. They concentrate wealth. Now, money manager capitalism doesn't mean we all work in the hedge fund industry. It means we live in a socio-economic system built to accumulate financial wealth. The financial sector and the financial sector way of thinking has come to dominate every aspect of society in money manager capitalism, and it hinders us to see where real value can be created by innovations and cooperations. This imperative to accumulate financial wealth cuts across the old division between states and markets. Also public institutions like the government and central banks, when they act to support financial asset values, or in any case, not to hurt financial investors. Now, Mazzucato talks about this in her book, especially chapters 2 and 3, and she applies that to Anglo-Saxon capitalism, and I've developed the same idea for our own Dutch brand of capitalism in my book, Land van Kleine Buffers, published last summer. So let me give some examples of what I mean by the rather general things I've just said. This is what is happening in the Netherlands, in case you need reminding. House prices are going through the roof, thanks to subsidized debt and extremely liberal borrowing norms, where up to 100% of the home value can be mortgaged. Rapidly rising real estate values bring capital gains and income to investors and banks and other lenders, and they bring volatility and polarization in society. This is happening not just because global interest rates or because of European central bank policies. House prices in the Netherlands have risen much faster than in the rest of the Eurozone. And most of the 16% house price rise of last year was made in Holland, not made in Frankfurt. Our high private debts and our obsession with the housing market keeps us from turning our attention to the mission-oriented kind of change that Mazzucato is advocating. A second thing that's going on in the Netherlands, and that's a symptom of money manager capitalism, is taxes. The government is paying lip service to fighting tax avoidance and berating governments in Southern Europe for their lax fiscal attitude. Meanwhile, we are facilitating as a tax haven the outflow of untaxed money from other economies with little benefit to our own economy. Domestically also, our tax system favors income from wealth, and we've seen increasing relative tax burdens on labor and entrepreneurship, while dividend income and real estate capital gains and rents are all lightly taxed. Business owners are borrowing from their own business through the infamous Box 3 loophole, And our tax system also favors the growth in debt in many other ways. This is because the growth in debt for one party means growth of financial assets and income for investors. It has become attractive for a listed company to pay more in dividends and to buy back their own shares rather than invest in the kind of innovations in their capital stock and in productivity growth that we need for a moonshot guide to changing capitalism. The counterpart of this is undermining of job security and wage growth and the increased burden on wage earners paying for social security and healthcare. And as a result, while investor income, house prices, share prices have all been skyrocketing, disposable wages have for the last 20 years been falling behind the rate of economic growth. And many Dutch households don't even have the financial buffers they should have, hence the title, Een land van kleine buffers. That's the country we live in. Which is a disgrace in a country that is enormously rich, both in money and talent and other resources. My last example of money manager capitalism as a barrier to transformative change is the state itself. One of Mazzucato's earlier book that she mentioned was called The Entrepreneurial State, but the Dutch governments of the last decade and more have not been behaving in the market-shaping, entrepreneurial way that could have been. They have been behaving just as if they were financial investors, keen to improve their balance sheet position. In the decade till the corona crisis, net public spending as a share of GDP has been falling each year, and there have even been public surpluses since 2015 till the corona crisis. Now, you may think surpluses sounds good, but think again. A public surplus means that the central government is paying less in supporting the economy than it takes out of the economy in taxes. As a result, we now see serious shortages in money, but also in the means to do a job in education, in health, in social work, even in the courts and the police. This is money manager capitalism all over again. Financial values count more than real values. The financial value of a low public debt has taken precedence over the value of education and courts and the rest of the public sector. The emergency spending during the pandemic is the exception, but there remains a decade and more of damage to our public sector to be repaired. At the same time that the government was behaving as if its job is not to support the economy, but to maximize the financial wealth of the government, at the same time that the government has decreased the government debt to unnecessary low levels, at the same time they were subsidizing the financial sector and the fossil fuel sectors by tens of millions over the last 10 years. And at the same time the public sector was squeezed. And this is not history, right? This is still going on. So this focus to accumulate financial wealth goes at the cost of creating real values, at the cost of the mission-oriented change that Mazzucato talks about. Before we are open to this change, we need to realize that wealth is not development. Let me say that again. Wealth is not development. Heaps of money and financial values, such as the thousands of billions of value in our real estate, or the 2,000 billion euros in pension savings, they are something different from the values that matter, such as job security, innovations, affordable housing, biodiversity, democracy, and the constitutional state. We've underinvested in all of these. All too often our focus on wealth accumulation doesn't make us richer, it makes us poorer. This idea that the economy is built to accumulate financial wealth stands in stark contrast to other visions of capitalism, where the economy exists to generate products and services and innovations, or to organize meaningful and satisfying work, or more generally to help ensure the material conditions for the good life. In particular, money manager capitalism is different from the classical liberal vision of the economy, which was held by thinkers such as John Stuart Mill, who wrote that government should help create equality of opportunity and an assured minimum standard of living. Mill and the other classical liberals were progressive liberals, where liberal, free, referred to the economist's freedom from rent extraction and wealth extraction that comes with concentrated ownership. The role of the state was to safeguard people and businesses from the power of landed property and the power of concentrated capital. And instead of this progressive liberalism, what we've built is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is characterized by a role of the state where the state safeguards the accumulation of wealth and protects the power of concentrated capital by low wealth taxes, international tax loopholes, real estate investment, subsidies to debt, cost cutting in the public sector in order to have government surpluses, and undermining job security. This all drives up asset values in share markets and debt, and it does nothing for innovation and productivity growth. You may wonder, is he still going on and on? I will come to an end pretty soon, but here's the link to Mazzucato's transformations, such as the Green New Deal. Money manager capitalism is pulling money and talent and other resources away from these challenges into the pointless pursuit of financial values. Money manager capitalism is polarizing society and creating economic insecurity that we see translated into political election outcomes. And until we change the money manager mindset, we are not ready to face the challenges that Mazzucato pointed out. Okay, I know I've spent most of my time now talking about problems, and this may all be rather gloomy. I'm not talking about solutions. And frankly, that is because there is so little awareness of these problems. Most Dutch people would deny that they live in a money manager capitalism country, even though it's staring them in the face. I also don't talk much about solutions so far because they are so obvious. They don't need much talking about. Close international tax loopholes. Change the domestic tax system, and taxes on labor can fall by many percentage points so that disposable incomes can rise at no cost to business or government. Apply labor market standards that are normal in other countries. Support economic security and working conditions in that way. Stop debt subsidies and liberal lending norms and investor money in residential housing. And house prices will stabilize. Increase the budgets for local government so they can simply do their job. They now don't have enough money to simply do their jobs. Make structural investments in education, health, the court system, in short, in the vital functions of government. It's even almost too simple to spell it out. Then why is it so hard to do? And I asked this to Mariana. Everybody nods when Mariana Mazzucato does her thing. We all love it, and it doesn't happen. Why is it so hard to respond to her challenge? It's because our government and all political parties that matter have embraced money manager capitalism. The biggest problem is not finding solutions. The biggest problem is escaping from the money manager mindset. Only then can we get to work on Moonshot guides to changing capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you for holding up this mirror and showing us what we see, or should see. I am going to take 15 minutes for the Q&A. I realized we started 15 minutes later this evening because there were people queuing outside to get into this theater. So I hope that is okay with you. I see some people leaving, so if that's necessary, please take the liberty to do so. I see that someone has a question already. I think I had some questions prepared, but I think we should just give the public priority and move to the first question right away, which is on my right hand.
Thank you, Chairman. I was wondering, Mariana Mazzucato speaks about a moonshot guide to changing capitalism, and I'm thinking of all these people in the room here who are member of a local council of Utrecht, for example, or of a regional parliament in Gelderland. How do I apply a moonshot to a province or a local authority? while provinces in the Netherlands, they buy public transport and make roads, and local authorities provide social services. So my question is to Marieke mainly, well, how can you translate Mazzucato to, let's say, the pedestrian level of, well, the local politician? And I have a request to Koen Brummer, can't we make a guide for local authorities or local D66 politicians, we don't need to help the others, to apply this thinking? Because it's quite a challenge and a work to do.
Yeah, thank you. Marieke, the question was directed to you.
I wish Mariana was still here, but I'll do my best. I think it's a combination of how you tell a story of public policy. Whether you talk incrementally and, for example, aligned with how policy is already organized, or whether you sketch more of a longer-term ambition in a way that people understand. That's how I see the appeal of the mission economy and how Mariana sketches it out. I also see the challenges of carrying over a vision over multiple coalitions, multiple election terms. We've seen with big infrastructure projects how hard it is to get, for example, budgets agreed that exceed maybe even the total budget of the period if you want to build a metro system or train connections or so on and so forth. So I hope that by rethinking what governments and democratically elected officials already do and positioning it in a more accessible way, we translate some of the mission economy closer to the citizen, because I do believe that that is very important.
Perhaps to follow up on this, I wanted to ask you, Dirk, do we see this money managers capitalism that you've been talking about, do we also see this at lower levels of government, such as provinces, municipalities? And if we do, and I know you don't like to talk about the solutions because they are so obvious, but if we do, what should provinces, municipalities do to address it?
Yes, we do. But I think it's very strong at the level of national governments especially, but we also see it at the level of cities, for instance, who speculate in land. This is one of the reasons for the housing crisis. Just to give a concrete example, we see it in housing corporations who trade in derivatives rather than build housing. This is already a while ago, but that's the sort of examples from financialization of public bodies or private public bodies that is hindering the creation of real values such as housing.
I think Marieke has a question.
So when I speak to colleagues in the United States or elsewhere about the city of Amsterdam and how I think 56% of housing is subsidized or social, they may faint because it is such an incredibly high number.
Yeah.
How do you relate such social policies to your reading of money manager capitalism?
Yeah, sorry. Well, the social housing sector in the Netherlands has been, I mean, it used to be working well, and it's been scaled down a lot over the last decades. And what's left is not working well because of scheefwonen and other problems. So the 65% doesn't say a lot when you don't know about how it's working, right? So that's one part of the solution. So part of the solution to the housing crisis is not only decreasing borrowing norms and addressing investor money, it's also fixing the rental markets. So that those are two communicating vessels. But I think we should be very careful of what we've left of the social housing sector and reform it rather than abolish it.
I think we have two questions. Do I see someone up there as well? Yes, I see some nodding, but I'll take this question first. Please go ahead.
A very short question. Sometimes I look at Switzerland and I'm starting to wonder, is a direct democracy not a way to get a bit closer to solutions? Thank you.
Sorry, could you repeat?
Could you repeat it?
I sometimes wonder if a direct democracy is not a way to get a bit closer to these solutions that you speak of. If you look at Switzerland, for instance.
Is that a question or a remark?
That's a question, yeah. Should we transition towards a direct democracy? That's the question.
Okay.
Can you repeat the question, sorry?
The question is referring to Switzerland, if we should transition to having more direct democracy, and if this could be a solution to the problems that you identify.
Yeah, well, I don't think so. That's the short answer. I think there's a lot of improvement possible in local democracy in the Netherlands. Academically, that's not my specialty, so I won't say anything about that. I'm not going to say everything about everything. But the country has been run in a very different way in the same democratic system that we have now.
Marietje, do you have anything to add to this?
I mean, we can spend a whole evening about direct democracy, but if it's related to the housing market, then I really have to pass.
Then I'll move to the question up there on my left hand.
Yes, thanks for the very inspiring talks. I have a question for Mr. Bezemer. I really enjoyed your book, A Country of Small Buffers. So I was very surprised to read in the newspaper this morning, CPB economists say buffers at Dutch banks can go down. And I was wondering how you received this news.
With sadness. I don't think that. So this quickly gets technical because banking buffers, well, to start with, een land van kleine buffers is about ready money for households. So the few thousand euros that they have in the bank that they can use immediately to buy a new car or a new washing machine in case of a calamity. That's the buffers that my book title is about. Bank buffers is their own capital that they can use when their clients fail to pay back loans and so they don't go bust. And there is many different kinds of buffers and definitions of buffers and measurements of them. And the consensus now is among many economists and politicians that the bank buffers are big enough now that after they have been very low for a long time. I disagree with that. So I don't think we should make the bank buffers more lower. One of the big boons to the banking sector of the corona crisis was that they could operate with laxer buffers. And I'm not happy with that because a banking crisis is possible. A housing market crisis is possible.
Mm-hmm. I hope that answers your question. I see some nodding. We have another question here in front of us, and then I've seen you, then I'll move to your question.
Moet ik de vraag nu in het Nederlands stellen of in het Engels?
We will continue in English.
Okay. How can we ensure that future or newer generations are able to pick up where older or current generations have left off? Because as Mariana said, we don't only need to rethink our terms like government, society, commonwealth. We also need to reimagine it. And for this, we also need a new skill set. We need to be able to shift through different perspectives, combine bridges or gap bridges between different disciplinaries. What is needed to ensure that future generations can fulfill this huge quest?
Yeah. Thank you. I think the question about future generations, Marietje, is definitely one that you have reflected on many times.
Yeah, two observations. I see a trend at universities to teach more interdisciplinarily and cross-disciplinarily. It's really quite different from, let's say, 2 decades ago and longer before. So I hope that allows for looking at similar challenges, but from different perspectives. At Stanford, for example, the computer sciences, the abstract sciences are very, very strong. And while it has often been celebrated as a great success, it is now considered a too narrow focus. And so there's a university-wide initiative to more broadly educate students, and I hope and I think from observation that is happening in the Netherlands as well. Coming back to the point that I made, and I really hope not, but I would not be surprised if the younger generation out of necessity and out of being confronted with crisis, will seek to break through a lot of the systems and the conventions that we know, and will come up with solutions, not so much because they may have been inspired by Mariana's book and may dream of missions, but because the conditions, loans, lack of access to housing, big generational discrepancies between capital or security of contracts and so on, could really, I think, lead to a rising up of a younger generation and hopefully finding new solutions that fit that generation.
Thank you. I hope that answered your question. I'm going to take the 2 more questions of the people who have walked up to the microphone. So first, the one on my right hand.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Bezemer. You give a scathing criticism of the Dutch economic policy of the last 10 years. And it pains me to say I'm having a hard time disagreeing with you. So I want to ask you to help me and try. Because there is obvious wealth in the Netherlands. There is public wealth. Education could be much better, but it's good. Healthcare is much better than it was 10 years ago. So help me out a little bit. Is it all that bad? Or can you find it in your heart to help a nuanced D66er to find some things in Dutch economic policy that at least give us a good head start to make it better? What have we done right and should expand on?
So we are now swinging from one extreme to the other. Usually the Dutch are very smug. They really think they're fantastic. And now you're saying, well, it's not all bad, is it? No, it's not all bad. I mean, we have a so-called refugee problem because all the world wants to live here. So obviously we do something right. Okay, we are a tremendously rich country, well-organized country. There's law and order, all kinds of things. I mean, multinationals want to be here not so much for the tax advantages, but because of the quality of living. I mean, it's all the more, if you cannot disagree with the list of bad things that I mentioned, it's all the more surprising and depressing that we allow all these things to happen when we have all the means to solve them. The subtitle of my book is Een land van kleine buffers. The subtitle is is genoeg geld, maar we gebruiken het verkeerd. We have plenty of money. We are a very, very, very rich country. In money, in talent. So there is nothing we can't solve, humanly speaking. So why are we behind on the climate challenge? Why do we have a housing crisis? Those are the questions. And maybe Mariana took the positive and heartwarming approach to this. My approach was maybe to make you angry, not to make you depressed, because anger gets you into action.
You succeeded. Thank you.
You have the honor to ask the final question.
The two of you highlight many problems and also have many great criticisms of our current economy. Are you optimistic about our economic future and that these problems will truly be solved?
All right. I think that is more or less the same question we just heard. Are you optimistic? I think this is also a nice question to end with, so I'm going to ask it to both of you, perhaps to start with you, Dirk.
I was very optimistic last year when the pandemic started, strangely, because as you will all remember, we were all sitting at home and Zooming and being on social media, telling each other that now everything would change, maybe capitalism would even end, or what have you. And then by the summer of 2020, we all wanted to be back to normal, and then the second wave came. And then we had elections, and I had expected, given the really strong mood and the need for change experienced and expressed by so many people, that the election outcomes would reflect this, and then they didn't. So I'm a lot more pessimistic than I was last year. The biggest question for me at the moment is I can clearly see the problems and the solutions, and I don't see why we don't act. Yeah. And I honestly can't say am I optimistic or pessimistic. I'm just wondering, why don't we act on so many fronts?
Marietje?
So I'm not an economist, but I worry about specific question around digitization and the role that technology plays in our society. And I hope that amidst the many other urgent topics that we have to solve, we don't overlook this one, because it truly does touch upon our rights and our freedoms, and it touches upon our ability to make our own decisions. The more knowledge and agency to operate technological and digitized processes moves from the public into private hands, as it continues to do, the less we know, the less solid the decisions are that we can make after a public debate, because our understanding of how algorithms work is left to companies and not to rooms like this. So if you ask me, in my own narrow field of work around technology and democracy, am I optimistic or pessimistic? I'm very worried, and I hope that as the new government takes shape, digitization and the impact on democracy does not get buried under the many other priorities that I'm sure people are knocking on the door about.
I think we may also applaud for this urgent call. We have talked for just a little more than 2 hours, and thank you so much for staying with us. We will probably continue this conversation, perhaps already over drinks, which you are most invited to join. Can I have one more round of applause for our wonderful speakers, Dirk Bezemer and Marianne Mazzucato. This was the 11th Marchant lecture of the Meester Hans van Mierlo Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us. Do follow us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and all the other big tech companies there are. You can also have a look at the books we have discussed today. Outside, there are stands of Savannah Bay and our Meester Hans van Mierlo Foundation just outside the theater. And last but not least, I mentioned it already, but you're most welcome to join us for drinks in the foyer, which is also just outside this theater. Thank you so much.
Nou, dat is aardig.